The old barn door creaked in the bitter wind, its rusted hinges crying out like a wounded animal inside of May and her 4 foals huddled together their breaths, rising in desperate clouds as they waited for mercy that might never come to brand on the mother's flank told a darker story, one of greed, cruelty, and secrets worth killing for if you believe in second chances and the healing power of compassion. Join us on this journey of hope against impossible odds. The morning dawned harsh and unforgiving, the kind that made David Cooper's bones ache with memories and regret his old forward pickup rumbled down Route 23, the heater, fighting a losing battle against Montana's merciless January chill at 62. He'd seen enough winds to know this one was different, meaner somehow, as if nature itself was angry. The radio crackled with static before dying completely, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the endless white landscape stretching before him. Emma would have loved this kind of morning. He thought, his chest tightening at the memory of his late wife. She'd always said the world was most honest when it was covered in snow, no place for secrets to hide. The fog hung thick and heavy, transforming the familiar road into something alien and uncertain. David adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his weathered hands clenching against the cold that seemed to seep through even the truck's cab. He was running late for a feed delivery to the Peterson place, but old Jack Peterson would understand. Everyone drove slower on mornings like this when the world seemed balanced on the edge of something dangerous. That's when he saw it, a dark smudge against the endless white, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first he thought it was just another abandoned piece of farm equipment, the kind that dotted these back roads like forgotten monuments to harder times. But as his truck drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something that made his heart stutter. A horse, no horses. Multiple shapes huddled together against the brutal wind. David's foot eased off the gas, the truck slowing despite the voice in his head telling him to keep going. He had deliveries to make, deadlines to meet. This wasn't his problem. Damn it, he muttered, already knowing he'd hate himself if he drove past. Emma's voice echoed in his memory, clear, as if she was sitting right beside him. Kindness isn't convenient, David. That's what makes it matter. He pulled the truck onto the shoulder tires, crunching through fresh snow. The engines rumble died, leaving him in a silence broken only by the howling wind grabbing his heavy coat from the passenger seat. David stepped out into the cold. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He trudged through snow that reached halfway up his boots, making his way toward the dark shapes. As he got closer, his stomach twisted. A May, once beautiful but now gaunt and trembling, stood protective over 4 folds huddled against their coats, which should have been sleek and healthy, were matted with ice and snow. Easy there, David called softly, approaching with his hand extended. The mare's head lifted weakly, her eyes meeting his in them. He saw something that stopped him cold, not fear, but a desperate kind of hope, as if she'd been waiting for someone, anyone, to stop the smallest FO barely visible behind its mother's legs. Let out a weak sound that cut straight through David's heart. He moved closer, snow crunching under his boots. The maid didn't shy away, but watched him with those knowing eyes. That's when he saw it, the ran on her flank, partially obscured by frost, but still visible. It wasn't any regular ranch Mary recognized, but something more elaborate, more professional. What happened to you? He murmured, reaching out slowly to brush snow from the mare's face. She leaned into his touch, too weak or too trusting to resist. The foes pressed closer to their mother, their small bodies shivering violently. David's mind rised. His truck wasn't equipped to transport horses, and the nearest trailer was back at his ranch, a good 30 minutes away. But one look at the smallest foal told him they didn't have that kind of time. The little one's legs were trembling, its breath coming in shallow puffs. He pulled out his phone, fingers clumsy with cold, as he dialed. Tom, it's David. I need your help out on Route 23, about 5 miles past the old Miller place. Bring your horse trailer. And Tom, hurry. As he waited, David shrugged off his coat and draped it over the weakest. F.O. the mayor watched him, trust in exhaustion wearing in her eyes. He remembered what Emmy used to say about horses, that they could read a person's soul better than any human looking into the mayor's eyes. Now he wondered what she saw in as a flash of movement, caught his attention headlights through the fog, but instead of Tom's familiar veterinary truck, the black SUV slowed. As it passed its tinted windows, revealing nothing of its occupants, something about it made David's skin crawl. The vehicle lingered for a moment before accelerating away, disappearing into the swirling snow. David turned back to the horses, but the unease remained. The brand on the mare's flank seemed to stand out. More clearly now, like a warning, this wasn't just about abandoned horses. Anymore, something told him he'd stumbled onto something much bigger, much darker. The mare nudged his shoulder. Gently, as if sensing his thoughts. "Don't worry, girl," he said softly, reaching up to pat her neck. "We'll figure this out in the distance." He heard the familiar rumble of Tom's truck. Help was coming, but as David stood there in the snow surrounded by these desperate creatures who placed their trust in him, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. Emma had always said that God puts angels in our path when we need them most. Looking at the mare and her foes, David wondered if sometimes those angels have for legs. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the tired faces gathered in the waiting room. David sat with his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on the closed examination room door. The man, her Foss, had been whisked away by Tom hours ago, but the smallest one, the one day David couldn't stop thinking about, was still fighting for its life. Sarah Mitchell from the feed store paced nearby, her auburn hair falling loose from its usual neat braid sheet airied. Minutes after David's call, bringing warming blankets and electrolytes, now she paused by the window watching snowfall in the parking lot outside. "What kind of person does this?" she asked her, voice tight with anger leaving them out there to die. David didn't answer. He was thinking about the brand he had seen on the mare's flank, now clearly visible under the clinic's bright lights. It wasn't like any livestock mark he'd encountered in 40 years of ranching, too precise, too corporate. Tom had photographed it earlier, his expression growing darker as he studied the intricate design. The examination room door opened and Tom emerged, removing his gloves with a weary sigh. David and Sarah both stood, tension thick in the air. "The mare's stable," Tom said, running a hand through his graying hair. "Dehydrated and malnourished, but she's strong. 3 of the foes are responding well to treatment, but the little one," he trailed off, shaking his head. "How bad?" David asked. His throat tight, pneumonia setting, and his body temperature was dangerously low. "When you found them, I've started him on antibiotics, but the next 24 hours will be critical." And Tom pulled something from his pocket, a small metal tag that must have been tangled in the mare's man. "Take a look at this." David took the tag, turning it over in his callous hands. The letters EG Labs were stamped into the metal, along with a series of numbers. Sarah leaned in to look, her brow furrowing. "Elite Equine Genetics," she said softly. "I've heard whispers about them. They were shut down last year after some scandal, but nobody seems to know exactly what happened." Tom nodded grimly. "They were breeding horses for specific traits, color patterns, conations, genetic markers, but there were rumors about their methods, about what happened to the Foss that didn't meet their standards." A cold weight settled in David's stomach, heavier than the winter storm outside. He remembered the black SUV on the highway. How had it lingered just a little too long? "They're still operating, aren't they?" Underground, Sarah's voice held a warning. "If that's true, these horses aren't just abandoned animals," they evidenced before anyone could respond. A weak gnawing sound came from the examination room. David was moving before he realized it, pushing through the door. With Tom close behind, the mare lifted her head as they entered, her eyes following their movements. The 3 stronger foes were huddled together under war ing blankets, but the smallest one lay apart, his breathing shallow and labored. David knelt beside the tiny foe, placing a gentle hand on his neck. Despite the warming blankets and fluids, the little one's body trembled. With each breath, something about his fighting spirit, his refusal to give up despite everything, touched something deep in David's heart. "Spirit," he said softly, "that's your name, little one. Because that's what you've got." God, the foe's ear twitched at the sound of his voice, and David could have sworn he saw the ghost of recognition in those huge, trusting eyes. The mare nickered softly, As if approving the name, a shadow passed across the clinic's window, drawing David's attention through the frosted glass. He caught a glimpse of a familiar black SUV crawling past in the snow this time. It didn't just pass by, it parked across the street, engine idling. "Tom," David said, quietly, not taking his eyes from the window. "You still got that old shotgun in your office?" Tom followed his gaze, his expression hardening. "They're watching us, they're watching them," Sarah corrected, moving protectively closer to the horses. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" David stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. He thought about Emma again, about how she'd always said that doing the right thing was rarely the easy thing. These horses had trusted him, had looked to him for mercy. When they had nothing left to give, he couldn't walk away. Now, even if he wanted to, we protect them, he said firmly, and we find out what elite echo and genetics is trying to hide. A soft nicker drew their attention back to the horses. The mare had stretched her neck out, touching her nose gently to Spirit sighed. The tiny foal stirred, lifting his head slightly at his mother's touch. It was a small movement, but in that moment it felt like a victory. Tom checked Spirit's vitals again, his experienced hands gentle but efficient, temperatures up slightly. "That's good, but he's not out of danger yet." "He won't be out of danger until we figure out what's really going on here," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "I know someone at the Livestock Bureau. Let me make some calls." David nodded, but his attention was fixed on Spirit and his mother. The mayor's eyes met his, and in them he saw the same trust she'd shown on the highway. She'd known somehow that he would stop, that he would help, that he would understand. Outside, the black SUV's engine gunned suddenly, and the vehicle pulled away into the swirling snow. But David knew they'd be back, whatever secrets that brand represented, whatever darkness lurked behind elite equine genetics' closed door. "It wasn't over. We should move them," Tom said, voicing what they were all thinking. "My clinics to expose here." David didn't hesitate. "My ranch, the old barn's empty, but it's solid. We can secure it, keep them safe until we figure this out." As if understanding, the mayor stepped closer to him, her breath warm against his arm. Spirit let out another weak nicker, and David felt something shift in his chest, a protectiveness he hadn't felt since Emma passed. These horses needed him, yes, but maybe needed them too. "All right," he said softly, reaching out to stroke the mare's nose. "Let's get you home." All of David's old ranch house felt alive for the first time in years, the silence broken by soft nickering from the restored barn. He sat at his kitchen table, papers spread before him in the warm glow of the overhead light. The documents Sarah had gathered painted a disturbing picture. Elite equine genetics wasn't just a breeding operation. It was something far more sinister. "Look at these numbers," Sarah said, pointing to a spreadsheet. Her finger traced down columns of figures that made David's stomach turn. They were selling phosphor, hundreds of thousands of dollars. "But look at the disposal records." Tom leaned in, his weathered face grim. "Those aren't just failed breeding attempts. They were experimenting with genetic manipulation, trying to create the perfect show horse. The ones that didn't match their criteria were left to die." David finished, his voice hard. He thought of Spirit still fighting for life in the barn, and the quiet strength of his mother. In the 3 days since bringing them to his ranch, he'd seen their personalities emerge. The mayor's gentle wisdom, the free, stronger Foals' playful resilience, and Spirit's deterred deity will deliver a sharp knock at the door made them all freeze. David rose slowly, exchanging glances with Tom, who moved quietly toward the shotgun propped by the back door. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Mr. Cooper," a woman's voice called out. "I'm Detective Lisa Martinez. I need to speak with you about some horses." David opened the door cautiously. The detective was shorter than he expected, but her badge and the authority in her stance were unmistakable. Snow swirled in behind her as she stepped inside, shaking it from her dark coat. "We've been investigating elite equine genetics for months," she said. "Once introductions were made and coffee was poured, but every time we get close, evidence disappears, witnesses go quiet. Those horses you found, they're the first solid lead we've had." Sarah spread out the documents. They gathered the brand, matches their registry mark, and look at this genetic profile's breeding records. Everything points to illegal experimentation. Detective Martinez nodded grimly. "They were trying to create Horses with specific traits, unusual colorings, enhanced muscle density even. Attempted genetic alterations for speed and endurance, the ones that didn't meet their standards she trailed off, but they all understood a sound from outside, caught David's attention, the crack of a branch in the freezing night. He moved to the window, peering into the darkness. Nothing moved in the yard, but his instincts told him they were being watched. They know we're onto them, Tom said quietly. That black SUV has been circling the ranch twice a day. We need to move carefully. Detective Martinez warned these people have money influence. They've buried investigations before, but if we can document everything, prove what they're doing. A sudden commotion from the barn cut through the night, the sharp whinny of the mare followed by the panic of stamping hose. David was moving before he could think, grabbing his coat as he rushed out into the snow. The others followed close behind. The barn door stood open, swinging in the bitter wind. David's heart stopped when he saw the empty stall where Spirit had been resting, but then he heard it a week. Nickering from the corner, the mare stood protectively over her smallest foe, who had somehow managed to stand for the first time since his rescue. Spirit wobbled on uncertain legs, but his eyes were bright with determination. The mare nudged him gently, supporting him as he took one shaky step, then another. David felt tears freeze on his cheeks as he watched the tiny FO fight against his weakness, against all odds. Well, would you look at that, Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Detective Martinez stepped forward, her phone raised. The document, the scene. This is what they were willing to throw away. A fighter, a survivor. The moment was shattered by the crunch of tires on snow. Headlights swept across the barn's interior as a vehicle pulled up outside. David moved instinctively between the horses and the door, but Detective Martinez was already drawing her weapon. Stay here, she ordered, moving toward the entrance. But the vehicle, the same black SUV they'd seen before, was already reversing, spinning in the snow before speeding away into the night. They'd been watching, waiting, learning. We need to move fast, Detective Martinez said, holstering her weapon. They know we're building a case. They'll try to silence this anyway they can. David looked at Spirit, still standing despite his trembling legs, and felt something harden inside him. Let them try. Sarah was already on her phone, scrolling through contacts. I know a reporter at the Tribune. Once the story breaks, they won't be able to bury it. We'll need protection, Tom added. I've got some friends in the Cowmen's Association. They can help us keep watch. Detective Martinez nodded approvingly. I'll station a patrol car nearby, but be careful, all of you. These people are desperate, and desperate people are dangerous. David barely heard them. He was watching Spirit take another wobbly step, the mayor's gentle encouragement guiding him. The other foes clustered around their brother, creating a protective circle of warmth and support. They thought you were worthless, David murmured, reaching out to stroke Spirit's nose. They were wrong about that, wrong about all of it. The night grew colder, but inside the barn, hope burned warm and bright. Spirit had found his feet, taken his first steps toward survival. Now it was time for David and the others to take theirs toward justice, toward truth, toward bringing light to the darkness that had nearly claimed these innocent lives. As they made plans and shared information, David couldn't help but think of Emma again. She would have loved us, not just saving the horses, but standing up for what was right, fighting back against cruelty with determination and heart. The mayor nickered softly, drawing his attention back to the present in her eyes. He saw the same quiet strength he recognized that first morning on the highway. They had trusted him then. These beautiful creatures who had every reason to fear humans. Now he would make sure that trust was honored, no matter what it cost. Outside, the wind howled like a warning, but inside the barn, surrounded by friends, both human in equine, David felt ready for whatever storm was coming. The morning dawned cold and gray, frost etching delicate patterns on the barn windows. David was already up checking on Spirit when he saw the first black SUV roll past his property. This time it wasn't alone. A sleek silver sedan followed close behind. His hand tightened on the pitchfork he'd been using to lay fresh straw. Spirit looked stronger today, standing more steadily on his legs, though still needing his mother's support. The mayor watched David with knowing eyes as he moved closer to the barn door, every muscle tensed, Something felt wrong, the crunch of tires on his gravel driveway confirmed his fears. Both vehicles were pulling and moving with deliberate purpose. David reached for his phone, sending a quick text to Detective Martinez before stepping out to meet whatever was coming. Two men emerged from the SUV, another from the sedan. They wore expensive coats against the cold, but it was their eyes that caught David's attention, cold and calculating like predators, sizing up prey. Mr. Cooper, the tallest one, said, his voice smooth as polished steel. I'm Lawrence Whitney, Executive Director of Elite Equine Genetics. I believe you have some property that belongs to U.S. David stood his ground, conscious of the barn door at his back. Abandoned animals aren't property, and from what I hear, Elite Equine doesn't exist anymore, not legally. Anyway, Whitney's smile didn't reach his eyes. Let's be reasonable here. Those horses represent millions in research and development. We're prepared to compensate you generously for their return. Not interested. David's voice was as cold as the morning air. Mr. Cooper. Whitney took a step forward. You seem like a practical man. Surely you understand the position you're in. These horses are part of a proprietary breeding program. Their genetic makeup is protected intellectual property. A soft whinny from inside the barn made David's heart clench. They're living creatures, he growled, not lab experiments, and they're not going anywhere. The other men began spreading out, trying to flank him. David held his ground, though his pulse quick. Where was Detective Martinez? You've made quite a nuisance of yourself. Whitney continued, his facade of politeness cracking, involving the police digging into things that don't concern you. It would be a shame if something were to happen to your ranch. Fire marshals are so particular about old barns these days. The thread hung in the frozen air like smoke. David's fingers curled into fist. That's funny, he said. I was just thinking what a shame it would be if someone leaked those breeding records. We found the one showing how many horses you disposed of when they didn't meet your standards. Whitney's face hardened. Those records don't exist, don't they? Sarah's voice rang out from behind him. She stood at the edge of the property, her phone raised, because I'm streaming this whole conversation live to about 5,000 followers right now. Wave to the camera, Mr. Whitney. The men spun toward her, caught off guard. In that moment, Tom's truck roared up the driveway, kicking up gravel. He wasn't alone. 3 more vehicles followed, members of the Cattlemen's Association. Inside, faces grim and determined. This is private property, Whitney snapped, but his confidence was wavering. Yes, it is. Detective Martinez's voice cut through the tension as her police cruiser pulled in, lights flashing. And you're trespassing, not to mention making threats that sounded an awful lot like witness intimidation. The other men were retreating to their vehicles, but Whitney stood his ground, his face twisted with rage. You have no idea what you're interfering with. These horses represent years of research, millions in investment. They represent cruelty. David interrupted, and it stops here. As if in response, spirits weak, but the determined whine he echoed from the barn. The mayor's stronger call followed, protective and proud. Whitney's eyes darted to the barn, then back to David, calculating. This isn't over, he said quietly. Actually, it is. Detective Martinez stepped forward, badge glinting. Lawrence Whitney, you're under arrest for animal cruelty, criminal threatening, and violation of the Genetic Engineering Ethics Act of 2023. As Martinez read, Whitney is right. David felt Sarah's hand on his arm. You okay? He nodded, watching as Whitney was led to the police car. The other vehicles were already speeding away, but David knew this wasn't truly over. People like Whitney had resources, connections inside the barn. Spirit had managed to walk to the door, his mother hovering protectively beside him. David moved them, running a gentle hand over Spirit's neck. The FO leaned into his touch, trusting in warm. They'll be back, Tom said, quietly joining them. Maybe not directly, but through lawyers' courts. Let them come, Sarah said firmly. We've got evidence, witnesses, and public opinion on our side. I've already had calls from 3 major news networks. David barely heard them. He was watching Spirit take another wobbling step, then another, growing stronger with each passing moment. The mayor nickered encouragingly, and for the first time Spirit answered with a clear, strong sound of his own. Besides, Detective Martinez added, returning from her car, we just executed search warrants on 3 elite equine facilities. What we Found she shook her head grimly. Let's just say Mr. Whitney has bigger problems. Then these horses, now the morning sun finally broke through the cloud sending. Shafts of golden light through the bar on doors. Spirit's coat gleamed in the light, his eyes bright with life and determination. Looking at him now, David couldn't imagine how anyone could have seen him as worthless as something to be. Discarded. Emma would be proud, Sarah said softly, seeming to read his thoughts of. All of this David nodded, his throat tight. His wife had always believed in standing up for what was right, in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Looking around at the friends gathered in his barn, at the horses who had brought them all together, he felt her presence stronger than ever. The mare pressed her nose against his shoulder, her breath warm in the cold air. Spirit wobbled closer, still unsteady, but growing stronger by the hour. They had survived the worst together, the cold, the abandonment, the threats, whatever came. Next they would face it the same way. To get the courthouse steps gleamed with morning frost as David adjusted his tie, Emma's favorite, the one she'd given him on their last anniversary together. Inside his coat pocket he carried the small metal tag from the mayor's man, its edges worn smooth from months of wearing it between his fingers like a talisman. The trial of Lawrence Whitney and elite equine genetics had drawn national attention. Animal rights activists gathered outside, holding signs with pictures of Spirit and his family. The story had touched something in people's hearts, a mother's desperate protection of her foster tiny survivors will to live, and a community's refusal to look away. Sarah met him at the courthouse doors, her usual work clothes replaced by a smart business suit. Ready, David nodded. Though his stomach churned in the months since Whitney's arrest, Spirit had grown stronger, his wobbling steps becoming sure and confident. But the legal battle had been fierce, with elite echoing lawyers fighting every piece of evidence. Every witness inside the courtroom. Detective Martinez sat with the prosecution team, surrounded by boxes of documents and evidence, photographs, the genetic testing results, the breeding records, the disposal orders, all of it telling a story of calculated cruelty masked as scientific progress. Whitney sat at the defense table, still immaculate in an expensive suit, but his confidence had cracked. The evidence retrieved from elite equine facilities had revealed horrors beyond what they'd imagined, dozens of failed experiments, genetic manipulations that left F suffering, systematic disposal of any animal that didn't meet their standards. As David took the witness stand, he felt Whitney's cold stare, but when he spoke, he wasn't speaking to the defendant or even to the jury. He was speaking to Spirit, to the mayor, to every animal that had suffered in silence. I found him in the snow. He began, his voice steady. The mare was standing over her foss, using her body to shield them from the wind. She was starving, but she'd given everything she had to keep them alive. The prosecutor displayed photos from that first morning, the mare's ribs visible through her frost-covered coat, the tiny foss huddled against her, Spirit barely clinging to life. A murmur ran through the courtroom, and this brand the prosecutor held up an enlarged photo of the mayor's flank. Elite equine mark. David confirmed, the same one we found on documentation at their facility. They tagged her like inventory, but she was so much more than that. She was a mother fighting for her babies' lives. Whitney's lawyer objected, calling it emotional manipulation, but the truth was emotional. It was impossible to tell this story without feeling the weight of it. The profound wrong they were trying to right. The prosecution's case was methodical, devastating. Former elite equine employees testified about the breeding program, about Whitney's obsession with creating the perfect horse regardless of the cost in animal suffering. Genetic experts explained how the modifications they had attempted had caused horrific deformities and health problems. And what happened to the foss that didn't meet specifications? The prosecutor asked one former lab technician. The young woman's voice shook. We were told they were being humanely euthanized, but then I saw the disposal orders. They were just dumping them, leaving them to die where no one would find them. Tom testified about Spear's condition, about the pneumonia that had nearly claimed his life. Sarah presented the documentation. She gathered the pattern of abandonments that led back to elite equine door. Detective Martinez laid out the criminal investigation, the web of shell companies and bribes that had kept the operation running. Even After its official shutdown through it all, Whitney SAT stone-faced, but David could see the man's composure, cracking the careful facade of scientific progress, was crumbling, revealing the ugly truth beneath. During a break in testimony, David stepped outside for air. Sarah followed, handing him a cup of coffee. Spirit took his first real gallop. Yesterday, she said softly around the paddock with the siblings, you should have seen him, David. He was flying. David smiled, picturing it. The tiny FO who could barely stand was now racing with the wind, defying every dark fate that had been planned for him. Emma would have loved that the jury seen the evidence. Sarah continued, they've heard the truth. Whitney can't hide behind his lawyers anymore, as if summoned by his name. Whitney appeared in the hallway, flanked by his legal team. He paused, looking at David with something like desperation in his eyes. We could still make a deal, he said quickly, his lawyers trying to hush him to research the breeding programs. It's worth millions. We could work something out. David looked at the man who had caused so much suffering, who had seen living creatures as nothing more than experiments to be discarded. If they failed, he thought of Spirit's fighting spirit, of the mayor's unwavering devotion, of Emma's belief in standing up for what was right. There's no deal, David said quietly. Those horses aren't for sale. They never were. The jury's deliberations lasted less than a day. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous: guilty on all counts: animal cruelty, illegal genetic experimentation, environmental violations, criminal conspiracy. The judge's sentence was 15 years in prison, massive fines, and a lifetime ban from any involvement with animal breeding or research outside the courthouse. Reporters clustered around David and his friends, cameras flashing, but he was already thinking of home, of the barn where Spirit and his family waited. The mayor would be watching for him, her wise eyes understanding as always. Spirit would be playing with his siblings, strong and healthy, living proof that sometimes justice does prevail. David, Sarah called out as he headed for his truck. The Associated Press wants a statement. What should I tell them? He thought for a moment, then smiled. Tell them love is stronger than greed. Tell them mercy matters more than money. And tell them to remember Spirit. The FO they thought was worthless turned out to be priceless. As he drove home through the gathering dusk, David felt lighter than he had in months. The fight wasn't completely over. There would be appeals, other battles to face, but today at least justice had prevailed. Today the powerful had been forced to answer for their cruelty, and waiting at home in a warm barn filled with clean straw and the sound of contented nickering was all the proof he needed that sometime spring came early to the ranch that year, painting the meadows in soft greens and wild violets. David stood on his front porch, coffee mug warm in his hands, as he watched Spirit race across the paddock, his copper coat gleaming in the morning sun. The once fragile FO now moved with the grace of a young colt's strong legs, carrying him swift and sure across the thawing earth. The mayor, Luna, as Sarah had named her, grazed nearby, keeping a watchful eye on all her children. Her cod had regained its luster, and her eyes held a peace that only time and trust could bring. The other three Foss, now nearly grown themselves, chased each other through the spring mud, their playful gnaw filling the air with joy. Some difference from a year ago. Tom's voice came from behind him. The veterinarian climbed the porch steps, carrying a bag of medical supplies for the monthly checkup that had become more ritual than necessity. David nodded, remembering that bitter winter morning when he'd found them in the snow. Hard to believe they're the same horses. They're not, Sarah added, pulling up in her truck with fresh hay and feed. And neither are you. She was right. The ranch had transformed over the past year, and not just because of the new fencing and renovated barn. Where emptiness had once ruled life, now flourished. The old training ring had been restored, the paddocks expanded, and it wasn't just Spirit's family anymore. 3 more rescued horses graze in the back pasture, survivors from other elite equine facilities that had been uncovered during the investigation. Each one had carried similar marks of neglect and abuse, but like Spirit, they have found healing in this place of second chances. The newspaper wants to do a follow-up story, Sarah said, leaning against the porch railing 1 year after the trial. They're calling it Spirit's Legacy. David watched as Spirit Powson's running to nuzzle one of the newly rescued Foos, gentle and encouraging just as his mother had been with him. Legacy, he repeated softly, Emma would have liked. That word, the screen door creaked open as Detective Martinez, Lisa now after everything they'd been through, joined them on the porch she'd stopped by regularly since the trial first. Officially then as a friend who discovered a love for horses, she never knew she had the last appeal was denied. Yesterday, she announced Whitney's conviction stand. He's serving every one of those 15 years. A weight lifted from David's shoulders, one he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. The legal battles had dragged on Whitney's lawyers, fighting to the end, but justice had prevailed more. Importantly, the case had led to stricter regulations on genetic research involving animals and increased funding for enforcement. Tom said thoughtfully when you first brought them in that morning, I thought we were just saving 5 horses. I never imagined. He gestured to the transformed ranch now officially registered as the Spirit's Hope Equine Sanctuary, the sign by the gate, Emma's favorite saying sometimes. Angels appear in the most unexpected places. David smiled, remembering all the moments that had led to this one, the community rallying around them during the trial, neighboring ranchers offering help and support, children coming to volunteer and learn about horse rescue. Spirit's story had touched something in people's hearts, reminding them of the power of compassion and the strength of the Spirit. Luna lifted her head from grazing, nickering softly as Spirit galloped past again. The young horse had grown into his name, his resilient spirit, touching everyone who met him. School groups visited regularly now, and David never tired of telling them Spirit's story, not just a part about rescue and survival, but the part about how saving him had saved something in all of them too. They're starting construction on the new rehabilitation center next week. Sarah reminded him the expansion would allow them to help more horses, provide better medical care, and offer educational programs about animal welfare and responsible breeding. Emma would be proud. Lisa said quietly, of all of this of you. David felt tears prick at his eyes as Spirit trotted over to the fence, reaching his head over for attention. This miracle of muscle and grace had once been a dying FO in the snow. David reached out to stroke his nose, feeling the warm breath against his palm. She is proud, he said softly. I feel it every day. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the spring air in the distance of school. Bus turned onto the long driveway, another group of children coming to learn about hope and healing, about the strength that can be found in mercy. Luna gathered her foes with a gentle call, moving closer to the fence, as if she too wanted to greet the visitors. She was a mother still, but also a teacher now, showing her children in every rescued horse that came to the sanctuary how to trust again, how to heal. You know what this place really is? Sarah asked, watching the bus approach. It's proof that love wins, that doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. David thought of that morning on the highway, how close he'd come to driving past one small choice made in a moment of compassion had rippled out to touch countless lives. Spirit's story had inspired other sanctuaries, led to better laws, and shown people that even the smallest and weakest among us deserve a chance to thrive. Emma always said that love multiplies. David said, his voice thick with emotion, that when you give it away, it doesn't divide, it grows. Spirit nickered softly as if in agreement. Then he wheeled away, racing back to play with his siblings as he's drumming a rhythm of joy on the spring earth. Luna watched him go, her eyes filled with the quiet pride of a mother who had never stopped believing in her children. David looked out over his transformed ranch, not just a sanctuary for horses now, but a sanctuary for hope itself. Every rescued animal that found healing here, every child who learned compassion here, every volunteer who discovered purpose here was part of Emma's legacy too, part of Spirit's legacy. And as the morning breeze carried the sound of children's excited voices mixing with the gentle nickering of horses, David knew that this was just the beginning. Some stories don't end, they just keep growing, touching more lives, spreading more light.